When I found out I was speaking almost on Valentine's Day, I thought I had to bring chocolate to people. So, I have Russian chocolate in the back from Ukraine. So, I think this will work now. Yes, we will. Okay, great. So, human trafficking. Human trafficking is a modern-day form of slavery in which a commercial sex act, organ removal, or labor bondage is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. So there's a lot of research that suggests that there are specific forms of trafficking that happen during war, including sexual exploitation, forced marriage, forced recruitment, child soldiers, and the removal of organs to finance operations. So the research I'll present today centers on human trafficking as a result of the war in Ukraine and Russia's war on Ukraine. According to estimates from the International Organization for Migration, the war has displaced 7.8 million people who have fled as refugees to neighboring countries, and another 6.9 million people who are displaced internally within Ukraine. So this most recent escalation of the war is the largest movement of people in Europe since World War II. And it has increased the number of people at risk for human trafficking and really created conditions ripe for exploitation. So I think I'm one of the only Americans talking on the Ukraine series, and so I wanted to kind of give some perspectives on my experience living in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine began in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in Donbass, which is the eastern region of Ukraine. Whoops, right here, I'm not going to trip. There we go, there's the Donbass. So basically, I spent a year from 2012 to 2013 in Kharkiv, Ukraine, which is located right here. So this is the border right here you can see with Russia and Ukraine. So I lived 26 miles from the Russian border when I lived in Ukraine. And when the full-scale invasion happened on February 24th, I was watching the tourism cameras from my city as bombs fell on a place that I once called home. So like most academics that study Ukraine, many of us for the first few months would get up very early and work to evacuate our colleagues and friends from the different regions, especially people that lived in the eastern regions. And many people I know have evacuated because there have been, and there still are, daily bombings in Kharkiv. And so for me, in the first months, conducting academic research on Ukraine was pretty much the farthest thing from my mind. And so there have been many pictures, I think, of this war. Many of us have seen it throughout the past year and seen pictures, but this is the picture that I will never forget for the rest of my life. This yellow building here was my former apartment building. On March 1st, a Russian bomb landed in downtown Kharkiv, destroying Freedom Square, which is the biggest square in Europe. It killed 35 of my neighbors, and almost 100 more people were injured. They were digging people out for weeks after that. And a few days later, the university I attended, Kharkiv National University, was also bombed. And so for me, basically the two places that I spent the most time, my house and my university in Ukraine, were destroyed. I spent the summer of 2022 in Latvia, and in my free time I volunteered at a reception center for Ukrainian refugees, and I met many people, including many people from Kharkiv, who had made their way to Latvia through Russian filtration camps and detention centers. And so my work there inspired me to write up this research. Many people told me, well, if you don't do it, somebody who's never lived in Ukraine is probably going to do it, so you should probably do something to be able to voice your opposition to the war. And throughout the research that I'll present today, I really questioned, should I be conducting research during this war when Ukrainians are dying every single day? I emailed my contacts in Ukraine, different people working at NGOs, and I was really surprised that every single one of them wrote me back. They wanted to be interviewed, they wanted to talk to me via Zoom or whatever type of medium that they had dependent on electricity in the city that day, and they really wanted their voices heard. And so one way, as a feminist researcher, we try to give back to the communities, that we're taking interviews and information from. And so every single organization that I interviewed, I donated money to, because I felt that was at least one way that I could try to make, their lives a little bit easier with a small donation to their organization. So I call this my reluctant research project on a war that I never wanted to happen, on a topic related to trafficking that when I left Ukraine in 2013, I honestly never thought I would have to interview and do research on war and human trafficking. So basically, the research that I'll present looks at different fieldwork. So I conducted fieldwork in Ukraine in 2012, 2013. I visited 11 of the 22 oblasts at that time. So we went, my husband and I lived there. We went throughout different regions of Ukraine, talking to different policymakers and NGOs about how trafficking policies in Ukraine work. And then the war started in 2014, and I went back in 2015 to do a bit more research and kind of updates looking at how the situation had changed as a result of the first stage of the war. So I used data from interviews, participant observation and anti-trafficking NGOs, and different refugee intake centers, and then I also did brief, I know there's some historians, so brief archival work. I always have to qualify that. So these are some photos. I have a lot of photos of different pictures from Ukraine. So this is the top here is the United Nations House in Ukraine. And so I went to, this was after the first stage of the war started. So this is in 2015. These are different, this is a UN cluster group for prevention. And the UN clusters are activated when there is a humanitarian situation. And so these are different organizations and entities working with gender-based violence during the first stage of the war. And then I also went to numerous press conferences at different media centers. So this is a press conference with the Ministry of Social Policy and the International Organization for Migration talking about the implementation of 527, which is the anti-trafficking hotline. So for trafficking in Ukraine, if you are experiencing a trafficking situation, you call 527, and that's the number like similar to a 911 type of call. I keep putting it over there. Okay, so most of the literature, and again, I never thought I would research war and human trafficking in a country that I lived in, and so most of the literature focused on war and human trafficking talks about the metaphorical war on human trafficking, similar to like the war on drugs, right? So they're talking about they're waging this war and combating human trafficking. So there isn't a ton of research out there that has been done. And so human trafficking, though, has been researched in Chechnya, Yugoslavia, Colombia, Syria, but those types of war are different from what is happening in Ukraine, right? So those wars are civil wars or separatist conflicts. That is not what is happening in Ukraine. Ukraine was invaded by another country, and so I felt that a lot of the literature didn't really add up to the situation that was happening in Ukraine. And of course, human trafficking dynamics in peacetime situations are very difficult it's a very difficult topic to research because victims don't self-identify as trafficking victims, and there are fewer testimonials for human trafficking, especially compared to sexual assault. And so human trafficking is overall a different crime. And so we see a lot of research that centers on prevalence estimates. So they try to determine how many people are trafficked. They look at push and pull factors, which I'll talk about a bit, including the different dynamics and trafficking flows. And then they look at government responsiveness, which also is really interesting in the Ukrainian case because many of the countries where research on war and trafficking has been done before have failed states. So they don't actually have operating governments, but Ukraine does. And so Ukraine had like a really great infrastructure, which I'll talk about before the war, and that has really helped them with combating trafficking since the first stage of the war and with the full-scale invasion. So basically, our previous research from Colombia talked about how the war amplified peace conditions favorable to human trafficking because the atmosphere of violence generated demand for human trafficking, and there were more opportunities for groups to facilitate trafficking. And then in Syria, other research found that the trafficking process really began when IDPs and refugees were already among the host communities. And we don't really see this in Ukraine. We see trafficking happening along the trafficking route, not so much when they're already displaced. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go. Oh yeah, I should say. So this is in Latvia. This is the opening, the entrance to the refugee intake center in Riga, the capital of Latvia. So this is a human trafficking sign, right? It says it's human trafficking, right? All of these different types of exploitation, like are your wages being garnished? Are you being controlled? Are people paying you and not working? And then it gives again a different human trafficking hotline number in Latvia, and every single country in the EU has a different human trafficking hotline number. And so we see these types of advertisements, right? But do they actually help us identify trafficking victims? Not really. So let's start. So basically I wanted to kind of establish a baseline. So what was trafficking like before the war? So up until 2013. So Ukraine, before the war started in 2014, was a source, transit, and destination country. So that means people were trafficked from Ukraine to other countries. They were used as a transit, trafficked through. So people came from other countries, specifically the Middle East, right, and were trafficked through Ukraine. And then increasingly, up until the war, the first stage of the war started, they were a destination country. So we actually saw people being trafficked to and exploited in Ukraine. And we see human trafficking consisting of men, women, and children. And so there were elements of forced labor, sex trafficking, child begging was really, really prevalent before the war started. And those are all kind of different types. We see a changing trend. So a lot of people, when they think about Eastern Europe, sexualize the women from there and think that human trafficking that happens is only sex trafficking and it only happens to women. But in 2008, we actually saw a change in Ukraine from sex trafficking female victims to male victims of forced labor. And so in 2008, that was kind of, a change that we saw, and that trend really continued until the war. So before the war started, we saw more male victims of forced labor than sex trafficking. And then before the war, Ukrainians were trafficked to other countries, and the big destination country was Russia, to a lesser extent Turkey and Poland. So these are some photos. So yeah, if you choose to make a Valentine's night or send a card, so this is one of the NGOs that I visit and send the cards to, right? So you can see kind of the cards this is the entrance to the shelter for trafficking victims. So that's hopefully what they will do when we send them these Valentines. So these are kind of some pictures of my time in Ukraine before. So this is a shelter. These are some beds for human trafficking victims. So when someone is exploited in a trafficking situation, there are trafficking shelters throughout Ukraine that people could go to be able to receive rehabilitation services. And this is actually an on-training site, so the women or former trafficking victims, they were taught to make tote bags, right? So a big thing that leads people to exploitation is poverty, and so the object of this project was to give them skills that they could use to start their own business. And so we see the women making these tote bags and learning how to sew and craft their own business. And this is they did trainings for high school students. This is an exceptionally fun training I went to in Poltava, where the high school students in Poltava were trained to be able to recognize a human trafficking situation. This is just a card that a kid in Ukraine made saying no to human trafficking. So these are kind of some images before the war. So then the first stage of the war. So this is 2014 up until the full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022. So evidence was reported during this stage of the use of child soldiers, so rebel forces. There was many rumors of rebel forces rebel forces, we were talking about the people in Donbass, right, of using child soldiers and forcing them and sometimes kidnapping them and putting them in place to be able to fight the war. So we see a lot of exploitation in the armed conflict during the first stage of the war. Then we also see a shift in human trafficking victims from male victims to female victims, but it's still forced labor. And so we see, the sex of the people change, but it's still forced labor. We don't see a ton of sexual exploitation. And war and displacement and the economic crisis in Ukraine led, to many people, increased vulnerability. So any type of war makes people, want to leave the situation. But a lot of the people that were displaced by the war and annexation, right, were from just certain regions. And Ukraine is a very large country, and so that many of them were able to be displaced to other regions. But we still see significant displacement. And then in the first stage, we see people, some of the people fleeing to Russia, but Russia is actually no longer the destination. After 2014, most labor migrants preferred Poland or Germany instead. So we see a shifting of dynamics during the first stage of the war. And this is, so the Ukrainians in the room will probably know where this is, but basically when I was there in 2015, I went to collective centers. So there are centers that are buildings that used to be something else that were turned by municipal authorities into housing for displaced people. And so this is Mezhahirna. So if any Ukrainians know in the room, know where it is. So this is the former president's palace. So Yanukovych, if you've ever heard of him, he's the guy that fled and killed a bunch of people and then fled to Russia, right? So basically these are the the guards that used to guard him. These are their houses. And so the Ukrainian government not only turned his former house into a museum on corruption, which is good. If you ever are in Ukraine, you should go visit it. It's pretty interesting. But they turned all of the places that, housed his massive staff in this giant residence outside of Kyiv into collective centers where they would house people who were displaced from Crimea or Donbass. And so this kind of shows you inside one of the rooms. This is one of the signs on the outside, right, that reads Ukraine is one, Ukraine is united, right? Those are the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And so I went with an NGO called Krimsos, like Krim SOS, Crimea SOS, and they would go and talk to people and talk about like how they could get them registered, because you have to register to be able to live at a certain place in Ukraine, and during the displacement many of them were registered still in Crimea, and so you had to go through the registration process, and they would work with them to be able to get their pensions and things like that paid. So it was a really interesting kind of look at how, I think Eurasia as a whole is really good at repurposing things. But yeah, I mean, basically in a year, Ukraine turned these like facilities that used to house people who guarded the former president into a collective centers where families live. I met a ton of kids because many times it was the kids and wife that were displaced during this time. Okay, so this leads us up to February 24th, 2022. So these are maybe some of the visuals that you saw. People waiting at the border in Poland, people taking trains, temporary housing in different places in Poland. And you probably know that, if you're 18 to, I believe it is 65, and as a man, you cannot leave Ukraine. So the vast majority of people evacuating during this time are women, children, and to a lesser extent, older retired men. Okay, so then I show these maps because I think it's really, it's been almost a year, right? So we have seen huge displacement and people going back and forth. So this is an updated map. So basically the red are people flowing in to Ukraine, right? The flow leaving Ukraine, and then the blue is the flow entering Ukraine. And so you can kind of see how many people, and this is up to date as of August 2022, but I think this is a good visualization of how people left and then they came back. And a lot of my respondents in talking to my interviews talked about how people leave and then they come back for a weekend to visit their relatives, and then they'll go back to Poland or Romania or wherever it is. So there's huge migration flows happening, at least in the western and likely southern regions of Ukraine. And you can see the entering versus leaving, right? These numbers are not stagnant and change every single day. And so again, this shows us the mobility of people going back and forth over the borders, right? Which can all lead to vulnerabilities for human trafficking. And also one thing that this doesn't show are the forced illegal deportations of Ukrainian citizens, right? The Russian Federation is forcibly deporting people from, it used to be the northern regions of Kyiv, right? It used to be different places in Kharkiv and all throughout the southern part. And so that isn't visualized in this, but that's an important thing, and what they're doing is completely illegal. You cannot deport people. But Russia has a history of doing that. So this also is another displacement. So this is internal displacement within Ukraine, right? So this map shows people leaving and coming, going back and forth across the border, but some people don't want to leave. They will just leave the area of Ukraine that they live in. And so it shows the green shows the increase in IDPs, which are internally displaced persons, and then the red shows the decrease in IDPs. And so again, this is up until May, right? So this is by early April 2022, the Russian forces were cleared of Kyiv, so we see people going back to the capital. September and October saw the Kharkiv offensive, and so by November, also Russia had withdrawn from Kherson, right? So like as Ukraine has gained land back and had victories, you see more population displacement, so people will return, or sometimes people will leave. So when the Ukrainian army comes back, right, many people will flee, and this is especially prevalent in Kherson, right? Because Kherson in the south has been continually bombed every single day. So many people, when they get the chance, will leave. So again, like this shows the internal displacement within the country of Ukraine, which I believe is, it's significant. And again, largest, mobilization of people since World War II. Okay, so now coming to human trafficking. So I think that these are some interesting visuals that I saw in the weeks and months after the invasion started. So again, the war started in 2014, the invasion started on February 24th, 2022. So we see, so this one I think was particularly interesting, right? So these are bombs falling on children, right? Children crying, and then this is like the unidentified arm of some trafficker coming in to traffic children, right? While the bombs are falling. This was done by the International Organization for Migration and also paid for by US taxpayers. So, which I think is interesting and might convey, a not accurate scenario of the trafficking situation. This is from Germany, right? It talks about reports that young women and children are being approached by human traffickers at the Ukrainian border crossing, right? Call the police. Here are different numbers in Poland and Germany. And then this is a flyer that is it's in German, right, from Berlin, and it talks about how people are behaving in noticeable ways in connection with the distribution of accommodations, right? So when the invasion started, there were a lot of people who needed places to stay very quickly, and so lots of people were offering their accommodations, right, and that can lead to a trafficking and exploitative situation. And so it's an order to call the police immediately if you're offered money for accommodation or observe people doing so. And the Federal Police of Germany warns young people and women traveling alone about these types of accommodation offers. So if you see something, contact the police. And so it's interesting that a lot of the visuals, again, that we see are geared towards sexual exploitation, when before the war it was really, focused on labor trafficking. And when I spoke with people in Ukraine, they said, the first month or two, we definitely saw more like survival sex and possible sexual exploitation, but the longer the war goes on, the more likely we will be seeing forced labor. And the existing anti-trafficking infrastructure within Ukraine is better than most countries, right? And so they're able to work, to be able to combat this, again, because they have a functioning government, whereas, Syria, Colombia, other countries didn't have as functioning of a government as Ukraine did. Okay, so here's some dynamics that happen after the full-scale invasion of 2022. So we see forced deportations, again, that I've talked about. Gender-based violence is prolific. Illegal conscription in the army, right? So forcing people into the army, which is a type of human trafficking. And then abductions, right? And so people being abducted off the street, disappearing, being forced to serve in the army. And all of these create vulnerabilities for exploitation. And so the attention, again, is fallen on sex trafficking. A lot of these visuals show us that it did. Oh yeah, I guess I forgot to translate the Ukrainian one down here. So this talks about like how to not become a victim of human trafficking when you're evacuating, and there's a question mark. So, okay. So while attention has fallen on sex trafficking, many of my respondents argued that forced labor, including forced begging, will likely be more prevalent as the conflict wears on. The one thing that has significantly changed things with the Ukrainian situation versus any other war is that Ukrainians have visa-free temporary protection in Europe. It is the first time the European Union has offered this. They started it after the Yugoslav wars because they knew that someday they would be seeing a large influx of people, and so this is the first time that it has been done. And what does it mean? It means that Ukrainians can live in Europe with this temporary protection order, and it's been extended numerous times, and many times includes, depending on the country, includes money, right, for the refugees. And so this has been like one of the greatest things that I think has limited vulnerabilities that we see in the trafficking situation that's happening since the invasion of 2022, right? So this visa-free protection gives them residence, and when we see residence, permits and things like that being used as something that exploits people in almost any other country, the fact that Ukrainians are able to live legally and obtain income within the EU is a game changer. And so we see, the visa-free protection being integral, and then the vast majority of the refugees have gone to Poland, Germany, Czech Republic, Moldova, Romania, right? So bordering countries, and then again, we see the forcible deportation. The U.S. government estimates more than 1 million, but again, those are just estimates, and because many of the people that are forcibly deported within the Russian interior don't claim refugee status. Usually you claim refugee status when you cross an international border, but Russia, of course, does not see anyone that they've taken and forcibly deported as crossing an international border, because they think that territory belongs to them, and so we don't see them declaring refugee status, and so that number is unknown at this point, but the US government estimates it to be about 1 million. So then these are the numbers of identified victims. So this kind of shows us from 2012 to 2022 the number of victims that have been identified by different entities. So the Ministry of Social Policy is the ministry that works to give people, there's like a human trafficking status that you can get if you're a victim of human trafficking in Ukraine, that gives you a one-time payment, can legalize your immigration status. And so we see, and it started in 2012, and so we see the numbers kind of, going up. And then if you remember, the first part of the war started in 2014, right? And then 2015, we see this lag. So that's the Ministry of Social Policy. The Ministry of Interior is the police. And then the IOM Rehabilitation Center is like the main rehabilitation center in Ukraine, where people can receive about a month of rehabilitation, and then they go to different organizations throughout Ukraine to continue their rehabilitation. But yeah, so this is why when I talk about trafficking, right, I tell people, well, there's a lag, right? So everyone's like, trafficking is exploding in Ukraine. And I'm like, well, they've only identified 179 people in all of 2022, right? And they're like, oh, well, then it's not trafficking. And I'm like, no, human trafficking is a longer crime. Right, so gender-based violence victims come forward. They know that they experienced sexually based violence. Right, they come forward. They tell their stories. Whereas trafficking is a crime that's really underneath the surface, and many people don't identify it. They just think, oh, I was exploited in this industry. Right, something bad happened to me. Things weren't great, but I'm free now, and things are okay. And so we see a significant lag with human trafficking that we saw in 2015. So the first stage of the war started in 2014. 2015, we see a lag. And then in 2022, it significantly goes down. And so I have numbers on it, hold on. Yeah, so it's an 82% decrease in 2022, which is much starker than the decrease of 17% in 2015. And this is the lowest number of victims of human trafficking identified by entities in Ukraine since 2000. So since they started tracking victims of human trafficking, this is the lowest number, right? This doesn't mean that trafficking's not happen. It means that there's a lag between people's trafficking, exploitation, and their exploitative situation, and when they actually come forward to receive rehabilitation. And then I will say, so I talked to people within the Ministry of Social Policy, right, and asked them for the demographics for the 35 people that were awarded this trafficking status. 66% were men, 31% of them were labor trafficking, and there was only one case of sex trafficking. And so again, it's interesting to see these kind of stereotypes that we've always been told about women being sex trafficked from Eastern Europe, when in reality that's not necessarily the case. And again, these are numbers from within Ukraine. So these are people that were either trafficked outside of Ukraine and came back, or were trafficked within Ukraine. And so if I, looked at all the numbers from the bordering countries, perhaps we would see a different story. And then one thing I should say too is, so basically before 2022, there were 28 reintegration partners that worked with the IOM. So there were 28 different organizations throughout Ukraine, and only 18% of them are still operational today. So that's a 36% decrease. And so we're seeing way fewer organizations that are able to work with trafficking victims. Some of the organizations that I talked to, their offices were blown up. Some of them, they had no windows because there was street fighting by their office. And there are just some areas of Ukraine that people can't go back to. And so having fewer organizations that can rehabilitate and help trafficking victims means that everyone is overwhelmed. And the infrastructure and offices that were obstructed during fighting means that fewer organizations exist. And so I think that there are definitely many more than that. And likely what we will see is, you can see in 2016 the numbers bouncing back and then increasing, right? And so I think that in 2023, 2024, the lag will subside and we will see significant increases. Okay, So there's human trafficking hotlines in Ukraine, operated by numerous organizations, but I wanted to make sure I gave the voice of a Ukrainian worker today, and I include them in the paper that I'm publishing on that too. But basically this is a woman that runs one of the human trafficking hotlines. She talked about, and I quote, "So it was really hard to work, and it was really important for us to continue our work during the war. The consultations were in demand and difficult for the consultants because they had calls with victims of sexual violence, domestic violence. People were calling with complex cases of psychological trauma while they were hiding in their basements. And in some cases in the occupied regions, there was nothing we could do, practically, apart from offering them emotional and psychological support." And this, to me, someone who I've known for more than a decade, like having them talk about the trauma that their consultants on this hotline are experiencing, right? So it's secondary trauma that, people would call and there was nothing they could do to help them. And that was particularly heartbreaking to me because they saw a significant increase in the hotline, in the calls to their hotline after the full-scale invasion. And they've also, so this is Lastrada, it operates another hotline, right? So this talks about the hotline. So the hotlines have been in existence, but some of them, because of the power outages, have had to stop working. And so this is talking about how, the hotline is going to stop working, but it's available on Telegram, Instagram, right? And so the attacks to infrastructure, even though this organization is located in Kyiv, right? So even though Kyiv isn't under direct attack, all of the, attacks on infrastructure, so we're talking about electricity, internet, all of those impact people's ability to actually help victims of human trafficking. And so they posted this on their Facebook, and they talked about how Facebook, Telegram, and Telegram chats were available to them. So even though many parts of the country aren't under direct, Russian attack, we still see the attacks of the infrastructure happening, affecting the response. And then, let's see. So then I've also, so I don't like to be right, but sadly I was. So we've seen a huge emergence of forced labor after the first initial 2 months. So there have been reports of exploitation in the occupied territories with workers from Central Asia who were sent to Mariupol to reconstruct the buildings there, right? So these are Tajik workers that haven't been paid, and it's basically labor exploitation, right? So they come in to rebuild the buildings that have been destroyed in Mariupol, which is the town in the south that is like completely decimated. And so we're seeing again, this is a Russian construction company that's coming in and exploiting people. And then this is a police bust in Spain. So Spain, they broke up a gang there of illegal tobacco factories where Ukrainian refugees worked in conditions, again, labor exploitation. So they assembled, tobacco, like cigarettes and things like that. They arrested 27 people in this bust. And the gang has alleged to have smuggled large quantities of tobacco, turning them into counterfeit cigarettes. And basically the Ukrainians who had fled the Russian invasion in their country were cramped into prefabricated shelters within the factories. They worked long hours and were not allowed to leave to avoid detection, and some had entered the country illegally, right? So these types of cases, so this is a bust across 3 different facilities in Spain, right? This is just one country, but this shows how even though Ukrainians have negotiated and a settled refugee status in Europe, we still see significant exploitation, and that it is forced labor and not sexual exploitation. Okay, so my key research findings for the paper, so Ukraine is clearly no longer a destination country, right? So like people aren't coming to Ukraine to be exploited. It isn't a transit country anymore, so we see migration dynamics changing. The at-risk population has increased, and the war and invasion have fueled push factors. So push factors are poverty, right? So if you don't have a home and you don't have a lot of money, that increases people's likelihood of leaving their home. If your home is unsafe because it's being bombed, again, those are all vulnerabilities that create push factors that can push people into a trafficking situation. And then the basic dynamics of trafficking have continued to occur, but the war, again, has exacerbated those vulnerabilities. And then the emphasis really, and in talking to people in the different ministries, right, there's a huge emphasis on the internally displaced persons. and not necessarily human trafficking, because there's way more IDPs, internally displaced persons, coming forward than there were previously. And so we see a shift, because it's the same Ministry of Social Policy that works with both issues. And so we've seen kind of a shift in attention on that. And so as the war stands currently, Ukrainian IDPs and refugees are facing displacement possibly for the foreseeable future. We will see. But more than 4.5 million Ukrainians have returned to Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. So people are really unsure unsure what will happen, unsure if people will return home. But I think those, arrows in the map that I showed of people coming back and going back and forth kind of show that people want to go home. When I worked in Latvia, like almost everyone I talked to wanted to go home. They didn't want to stay in a foreign country. So the return and reversal of displacement within the UN, less than 3% of refugees return to their country of origin. So again, Ukraine might be the shining case once they win, that we will see, refugees being able to return home, but historically that isn't the case. And a couple of things that I'm especially worried about are UN peacekeepers. So once peace is achieved, UN peacekeepers have a horrible record of trafficking people. They did it in Yugoslavia and Bosnia. And so I'm really worried that if UN peacekeepers are brought in, that we will see brought in to bring the peace. They will also bring in elements of exploitation and human trafficking. And then the construction, right, we can already see it in the construction efforts in Mariupol. The construction and rebuilding efforts can also facilitate aspects of forced labor. And before the war, there were actually lots of Ukrainians that were exploited in the reconstruction efforts in Iraq from US companies. And so I'm worried in the reconstruction that we will see a similar type of exploitation with that. So that is the end of my talk. I'm sorry that was a bit depressing. I always think human trafficking is a really, really tough topic to talk about, but I'm optimistic in the fact that Ukraine has like a great infrastructure. They have, awesome anti-trafficking advocates that have worked, even though, bombings, no power, things like that have worked to be able to help victims. And I firmly believe that if the US arms Ukraine better, that Ukrainians will win. So. Thank you so much to Chris for sponsoring my visit. It's been great to come back to Lawrence and go to all the coffee shops that I went to when I was a graduate student, and to political science and women and gender and sexuality.